Engagers, this is Professor Game, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking who bring us the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration to help us in the process of using games and gamification in our daily lives, for example, to learn what we are teaching. And I am Rob Alvarez. I work at IronHack, teach at IE Business School University, and so much more, and host this podcast. If you have an extra second, please go ahead and subscribe for free to our email list at professorgame.com/subscribe. Hey Engagers, welcome back to another episode of the Professor Game podcast. And we are today with Chris. But Chris, before we take off, we want to know, are you prepared to engage?
I'm ready to engage.
Let's do this because we have today with us Chris Hood, who is a digital strategist and technology entrepreneur with over 30 years of experience in online entertainment and marketing from TV, film, music, and video games. And as the head of business innovation and strategy for Google, he engages with some of the top companies in the world to develop digital transformation strategies that grow business value at Google. He also hosts the weekly business podcast, That Digital Show. And previously, he worked as a director for Fox Broadcasting, where he developed storytelling technologies and innovated new mechanisms for viewers to engage with the television content for shows like Glee, Gotham, Sleepy Hollow, The X Factor, and American Idol. His work included the development of TV Everywhere products and interactive media platforms for streaming services, and he also teaches information technology, Department of Southern New Hampshire University at Colorado Technical University. So, Chris, I don't know if there's anything that we're missing from that intro you want to make sure that we get in.
No, I think you covered it.
Amazing. So, Chris, you do so many things. You've done so many things. We just sort of want to get in on your shoes for a little bit and know what does a regular day, what does life with Chris look like nowadays, basically?
Yeah, well, crazy enough, you just did that intro, and one of the things that has changed in literally just the last week was at Google, and this is public knowledge, and I've made an announcement about it. At Google, we recently had 12,000 people be laid off, and I was one of those 12,000 people. So I am actually no longer at Google, and this is the first podcast I'm doing post-Google, which is kind of exciting for me. But my day-to-day right now includes sleeping in, waking up, having some breakfast, relaxing a little bit on the porch. Like, it's fabulous, actually. You know, no meetings. It sounds awful maybe, but right now I am spending a lot of time just enjoying life and reflecting and spending time with family and detoxifying myself from the corporate world. I am doing some other things right now. I'm working on a book. I'm working on building a new podcast. I'm obviously looking and exploring job opportunities. So there is a lot of things going on in my day-to-day life today. But if we were to kind of rewind the clock a little bit, what my primary role at Google was spending a lot of time talking with businesses about how to transform, how to avoid disruption in the marketplaces, and ultimately how to think about digital strategies in a way that would grow their business. And those are things that I still talk about today, even if I'm not at Google, because I think they're really important. We're all faced with disruption on a daily basis, just like a business might be disrupted. I was disrupted from my job. And we all have to go through a transformation process. We have to understand that change is constant, and that transformation can be in the form of a new job or personal reflection when I'm sleeping in and having breakfast on my porch. All of those things are what I talk about: the disruption, the transformation, and doing that through digital strategies and even game theories.
Amazing. So talking about all those things, and you mentioned all the experience you have, all the reflections that you have nowadays as well. Sometimes perhaps it goes through your mind, one of those times when you're, especially because, as you know, we talk a lot about strategies in games and game design and gamification and all those things around that, because this is a Professor Game podcast. So if you have any, so those fail moments, those first attempts in learning, favorite failure, however you want to call it, we want to sit there with you. We want to listen to that story and perhaps take a few lessons home.
Well, that's one of the other things that I spend a lot of time talking with businesses about. And when I was at Google, it was at the forefront often. When we think about failing, the thought of failing sometimes is scary for people. But we know that the capabilities of organizations to evolve, again, transform, or even innovate new ideas has to come from failure. And so failure is or should be looked at as something positive. You learn from failures. I actually just wrote a blog piece on my website that talks about disruptions and transformation from that failure perspective. I have thousands of examples of failures in my life, in my career. All of those failures have led to something better and have led to a learned practice. You learn from those and you change, you adapt. So if we take this at a very basic concept, if you were trying to fix something and you did it wrong and you turned on the power switch and it didn't turn back on, that's a failure. And you're going to go back and try something else. And you're going to keep trying different things until you flip that power switch and it turns on successfully. That's a natural instinctive for us to do, but we don't think about it in the words failure, because when we hear that, we're like, oh, that's a bad thing. It's just a learning process. If we take that and put it into the concept of like a video game, I'll say right now I'm playing a lot of World of Warcraft, and
Hmm.
we're working on one of the raids. And, you've got a team of 20 people that are going into the raid, and you're working on a boss and you wipe. And when you wipe, you get maybe frustrated, but you learn from that. And then you go back and you try it again. And I think in the race to worlds for the final boss on Mythic, for again, anybody who plays World of Warcraft, I think the team that successfully finally cleared the boss had over 250 attempts at the boss before they successfully took it down.
Ouch.
That shows you an example of failure after failure after failure 250 times before they were able to be successful. It's all learning. Now, occasionally you probably do something dumb and you're like, oh, what if I stick my finger in the socket? Oh, nope, that didn't work. But you're going to occasionally do some not so bright things, but it's still a learning process. And that's something that you should live by actually on a daily basis is how can I learn from this, grow from this, and then change and evolve?
Amazing, amazing. Is there any of those experiences that maybe stands out that we could sort of live with you a little bit?
Oh, if I'm thinking about the gaming world, so if I go all the way back into, let's take a time travel back into the 1990s, one of the first games that I worked on was called Ultima Online. It was also one of the first massive multiplayer games. And, when you start designing concepts around how players are going to interact, you often have a thought in your mind like, oh, players are going to act a certain way. And you'll put in mechanics within a game for a specific reason. And you never will forecast what we'll call exploits or problems that might materialize from those mechanics. So, an example of this was the skill of stealing. You know, stealing was implemented as a mechanism by which you could go on a quest, find an NPC, and steal from that NPC. Stealing was also enabled against other players. And what you ended up having was these griefers who would be living at the banks, constantly stealing from other players and harassing them because it was not intended to be used in that way. But one thing that we find from video games is that players will always find a way to do something with the tools that they've been provided. Of course, the game was also filled with various types of bugs and exploits that people began to abuse to get to other loot and content in the game that wasn't intended. It was a real lessons learned for me because you realize that no matter how well you might think you are designing a mechanic, there's still opportunity for failure in that mechanic, even if the mechanic works exactly as you programmed it or intended it to be, because you have the unknown factors. You have the unknown factors of other millions of people using that and trying to use it in different ways. And anybody who plays video games knows full well not only exploits, but Easter eggs and hidden gems and backdoors and any number of things. And like, oh, hey, here's a cliff. What if I jump over that cliff? What will happen? We all do that because we're all curious people and we're all going to explore. And those are the times that you are not accounting for in your design practice. And we can build parallels to this within the business world, because same thing, businesses build technologies for specific purposes, and then people will come in, customers or users will come in, use that technology and potentially use it or exploit it or find ways to use it that was unintended. And the lessons learned here is, how do you get more eyeballs and experiences and people involved in that so that you could potentially account for those different use cases so that you can maximize the customer or user experience before it potentially gets exploited or before you potentially have a problem. And again, it's a great example of something that no one predicted. It was a massive failure per se, but huge lessons learned. And if you actually look at video game design and progression on mechanics over the course of the last 20 years, a lot of it was actually rooted in the lessons learned with Ultima Online and some of those unintended features, we'll call them, that were originally programmed correctly.
Amazing. Thank you for that experience. And it sort of brings back many memories as well. I'm sure some of the listeners are thinking about Ultima Online precisely, and all the experience that many people had in that space. And Chris, let's actually turn it around. And in that same space of, video games and game design and all these things, do you have any, one of those, any proud moments that you want to share actually with us? One of those things that actually went well and you want to say, well, this went well. Maybe these are some of the success factors, some of the things we did. Again, we want to be there with you and learn some of those lessons.
Yeah, I've had a lot of wonderful experiences in and out of the gaming space. As you mentioned at the start, I've been in media and entertainment for well over 30 years. That has been across movies and television and music industry and video games. I've started up game companies. I've had parts in really exciting movies and television series. There's just been a lot of things that I'm very proud of and really have been privileged to be a part of. And, I can't think of any one thing off the top of my head, but, I've been able to just follow my passions. I love the gaming space. I love entertainment. I love watching movies. And so, I think really if I was to pinpoint this, it's that I've been able to continuously do things that I love doing. That alone, I think, is a success. And for those out there that are thinking about like, oh, I want to get into the video game space, or I want to get into this or that, I want a job doing whatever, do something you are passionate about. I know it sounds cliche and you've probably heard it before, but the more aligned you can be with the things that you love doing, the happier you are going to be and the more success you're going to find. Because the last thing anybody wants to do is go to a job every day and you're miserable and you're like, I don't like what I'm doing. I don't like my company. I don't like my boss. I don't like my coworkers. I don't like what I'm eating for lunch, whatever. You've got to be able to just wake up and be excited and happy to do something for yourself. And if you can do that, that is success. And for me, the fact that I've been in media and entertainment for 35 years, it's something that I love. It's something that I do. Just like I said, I play World of Warcraft. I play League of Legends. There's other games that I'm playing. There's movies and TV series that I love to watch. I cuddle up on the couch, and to have a soda and watch something. Like, if I can do that in my personal time because I like doing it, as well as do it for work as my career, those are successful moments. And I would say that is the biggest success of my career.
It sounds amazing. And are there any tips that you could give to people trying to reach that sort of ultimate goal in life that you've been talking about?
What do you love doing? So you actually ask it's a basic question, but there's actually a very interesting element to this. And let me explain. I have a story of somebody who not recently, this was probably 2 years ago, somebody I was consulting with, and they called me up and we were talking, and I was explaining my background in the video game space, as well as some of the other things that I do. And it was a woman. She was an executive at a very large company. And she says to me, my son wants to get into the video game space, but he has no experience. And he's also thinking about dropping out of school. And I just don't think that this is a great idea. There's no benefit of going into the video game space. It's not a big industry. And, she had a lot of opinions about not only the space, but what her son should be doing. I think he should stay in school. He's in school for fashion design. He really likes fashion design. So I don't know why he wants to get in video games. And I said, look, there's an opportunity here. Actually, first off, I'm not going to tell him to go back to school. If he doesn't want to go back to school, that's on him. You've got to want to go to school. You've got to want to put in the work. You want to do the homework and get the degree. If you don't want to do it, then if you get forced to do it, you're most likely not going to do it anyway. So you can't force somebody to do something they don't want to do, right? Second off, he's in fashion design, and you don't see the connection between fashion design and video games, but there is. All of the games today require some type of fashion. They're wearing armor or clothes or skins or, anything. One of the biggest marketplaces in the video game space right now is skins that you can buy. All of those outfits and clothes and add-ons are being designed by somebody. Why not be designed by somebody who has an actual fashion background and is passionate about that? So you've got somebody now who has two passions, fashion and video games, and they want to combine those together. Why not? So do what you love doing is ultimately the goal. And you have to be able to sit there and say to yourself, these are the things that I love doing. And maybe it's surfing, maybe it's eating, maybe it's cooking, maybe it's video games, maybe it's something else. Write those down and then begin to look at what are the things that I like to do and what are the jobs that touch on these things. And remember that just because you don't think that there is a connection doesn't mean that there isn't a connection or that you can't make a connection, like the fashion design to video game. I once had a topic at a conference, a GDC, I spoke at, and I was speaking to a bunch of college students. And I went around the room actually, and I said, okay, what is your degree program? And somebody said, well, I'm in astronomy. And I'm like, great. Video games in space, video games that deal with star systems, like that knowledge is transferable into the gaming space. And you go around and you talk, oh, I'm going to be a doctor. Video games are in medical and healthcare all over the place. Gamification and the same Unreal engines that we're using for video games are being used to map the human body. So there are parallels that you have to better understand, and the opportunities come as soon as you start to say, look, this is what I love to do. This is my passion. This is what I want to focus on. You take that and then you say, okay, how do I map this to that industry or another job? And once you can start to do that, you can start to find that happiness. If you're going to continue to just wake up every day and, I'm going to be an analyst because it's an opportunity to get into, whatever, you're just trying to convince yourself you've got to be able to literally say, I love doing this. And if you can't say that, then you have to start thinking about what it is that you love doing so that you can find those opportunities to be happy.
Sounds amazing. So thanks for all of that, Chris, because it's sometimes hard, getting into the video game space, into gamification. People who like games and think, oh, I've played video games all my life and now I want to, get into video games. And it's not always, they might be connected, might not be connected. Maybe you have the skills, maybe you really like what it takes, maybe you don't. So it's about, encountering all those things, all those spaces as you were mentioning, and understanding yourself and seeing how you can connect your skills, the things that you do, to something that you actually love. So thank you for all those recommendations. Just a quick break before we continue. Are you enjoying this podcast? If you're listening through a podcasting app, please subscribe and rate us on the app. This will be of great help to reach more engagers so we can change the world together through gamification. And Chris, when creating an exciting game, a good game, is there something that you would say is sort of a best practice? Something that you would say, well, do this or this kind of things, or use this strategy, and your game is at least going to be a little bit better?
For me, I think it's always about, how do I break your typical strategies? I'm trying to think of something different that is going to inspire and awe the player. It can't be, you've got the basic mechanics that you're always going to have, but you've got to be able to think something differently. And that's the hard part, because if we were to break down video games, there's really only a couple of premises, right? Good versus evil, or evil versus good, or good versus good, or evil versus evil. It's still one versus the other. If we think about games like chess or checkers, board games as an example, it's still one versus one, and it's still red versus black, or white versus black, good versus evil, evil versus good, etc. If we are to further break that down, and you say, well, I want to add a third person to it. Is there 3-person checkers, right? Is there 3-person chess? And then we start adding more dimensions to it and more players to it. And ultimately, at the end of the day, you still have a basic concept of good versus evil. That's really the basic concept of every game. But then how do we, again, make this different, right? How do we change that perspective and create something compelling and interesting that we haven't really seen before? That's very hard, because even if you look at all of the games across the map, the similarities are all there. The teamwork, capture the flag as an example. Capture the flag is one team going to try to capture the other flag. So League of Legends is nothing more than capture the flag, right? You can break all of those games down and find what's the root of the concept. It's very hard then to try to develop some type of new game theory or strategy. The biggest challenge is to try to make something that's going to entice somebody just enough that they're like, oh, I can beat this, but it's going to take a little bit of time. Now, this is where mobile games have come in. This is where monetization strategies have come in, because, oh, I know I can get there. You stimulate them for the first 10 minutes of playing the game, and they're like, the next level. Oh, I just missed it. Oh, I just missed it. Hey, pay $9.99 and you can unlock this and you can get it, right? I mean, again, end of the day, there's a strategy behind the concept of, at what point do you make things too challenging that you either want to pay for them to unlock, or get more gear or better gear to unlock, or to get to that next level. Again, all of that is basically the same. So, I think when I chat with people about games, and in the game design sessions that I've been in, I'm like, well, how do you change that perspective? How do we change that? And I think there's been some good games that have done that, especially in the open world space. So, Assassin's Creed comes to mind, where they kind of took the typical RPG, but they kind of changed the perspective. Same thing with Red Dead Redemption. They made it open world. They gave you kind of free range to do and explore what you wanted to do, but they just adjusted the way that you achieve things a little bit. it's hard to constantly come up with new ideas. And so really all you're doing is coming up with the framework, again, good versus evil, and then you're wrapping it with better stories, more interesting characters, more integrated ways of thinking, better artificial intelligence. So if we go all the way back to, like, people will try things just for the sake of trying things. Oh, look, hey, there's a cliff. What if I jump over that? What happens? Well, imagine if you jumped over that cliff, you expected it, and all of a sudden a parachute opened up and it dropped you down into a pot of gold. Like, well, that's unexpected, right? You could hide mechanics into the game to create unlockable experiences that no one thought of. Another great example of a mechanic that I had been talking, with some companies about was, we all understand leveling. You start at level 1, you go to level 2, 3, you get to level 99 or whatever level you want. The mechanic is so ingrained in us that we just readily accept it. And I challenged people, I challenged game designers, why have any leveling? There's a grind, there's a mentality to that. Yeah, I get it. I've got to get to level 99. When I get to level 99, I'm all powerful, fine. But what if there was no levels? What if you were always just the same level? How could you still unlock and achieve godlike status without going through the grind of leveling? Maybe the grind is something different. And that's how you have to think about this stuff. You've got to just ask the questions and shift the mentality, and not just accept, like, well, there's always been leveling, so we're always going to keep leveling. How do we innovate on that leveling system and try something different? And I think if you continuously ask the questions, but what if we did it differently, then you can get into some really exciting design premises.
Amazing. So it's sort of taking a look at things in a different way. Could we, if we needed to super quickly summarize it, would that make sense?
Exactly. Yeah. We have a character, they have to level. Let's not do 1 through 100 levels. What else could we do? Go. And if you and I were, and a couple other people were sitting in front of a whiteboard brainstorming, we could probably come up with 5 different other ways to do a leveling system without actually leveling. And that's the process.
Amazing. Thank you so much. So you've given a fantastic recommendation on a sort of best practice when thinking of games. And we would like to know if there's anybody that you would like to hear giving recommendations like you have, sort of talking about their experience, sort of a future guest for Professor Game.
Well, I mentioned I had started a video game company called Blind Squirrel Games. They are located in California. There are several people at that organization that would have great perspective on video games and game theory. I would love to hear somebody from the company come on and share their perspectives.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And is there, keeping up with recommendations, is there a book that you recommend to this audience? And why would you recommend that book?
There's actually a business book. It's typically for tech companies, but I recommend it to really any company. And I think it would be great within the gaming space because it's a disconnect from what the gaming mentality is. But the book is called Sprint, and SPRINT, Sprint. Just like if you are familiar with Agile and a sprint that you would do, although in this case, the sprint does not reference an Agile session. Sprint is by a gentleman named Jake Knapp, JakeNKNAPP. And the book takes you through how to solve big problems in just 5 days. So it's sort of like a workshop, a 5-day workshop of how to solve and build new ideas out in 5 days. So imagine if you think about video games, usually they're very lengthy. Every so often you might see a hackathon, or something along those lines. But if I was to challenge you to build a video game in 5 days, could you do it from design to art to concepts to, publishing? There's a lot of platforms out there that will help you accelerate that. But even if you just remove the video game part, The book is around how do you solve these big problems in 5 days? And it takes you through a day-to-day strategy and workshop sessions on what to do on day 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 to help you innovate, solve problems, and think about it. So even if, as opposed to, say, building an entire video game, maybe it's just a mechanic. Maybe you say, hey, we're building a game and we're focused on, we'll use leveling again, the leveling mechanic. We've got this problem. You could leverage this book, sprint through a 5-day session to help solve how to build the new leveling mechanic that you want to build. Again, it's not designed, the book wasn't written for the video game space, but I think that it applies to all businesses. It's a great concept and definitely worth reading.
Amazing. That's the one that sort of the inventor of the design sprint. Is that right?
No, this is a gentleman who worked at Google. He left
Mm-hmm.
Google and started doing some consulting work. It's based on a concept that was invented at Google around a little about design thinking processes, but a concept of, again, customer success and accelerating business outcomes through workshops. He just called it sprints because you're sprinting to that finish line.
Yeah. Gotcha. Fantastic. Amazing. And in this world of creating games and creating engagement in general, what would you say is your superpower, that thing that you do at least better than most other people?
Think about things differently, just as we were talking about. If we are thinking about leveling, is let's not go with the status quo. Let's think about this differently. And so I love just changing perspectives or having new mindsets or helping individuals see things through a different perspective. It's pretty much the number one thing that I did at Google and probably will continue to do is let's just think about this differently. Let's shift our mindset, maybe have a conversation. It may be right, it may be wrong, doesn't matter. All we're doing is talking, just like we are right now. We're talking about video games, and hopefully I'm sharing some ideas and some theories that might shift your mindset, whether that's hiring or finding a new job or designing mechanics, right? That's something that I love doing is I don't believe that we have to keep doing things the same way because we've always done them that way. Innovation is about thinking about it differently. And I bring that perspective to every conversation.
Amazing. It sounds like a very useful one to have, especially in all the things that you've been doing of late and throughout all these years. And there's a difficult question, so to speak. This is a tough one. This is a test kind of question, and it has to do with games once again. And we would like to know, what is your favorite game? What would you call your favorite game?
Ooh, my favorite game of all time is Ultima 3. And the only reason Ultima 3 was my favorite game was because that was the first game I played in the series. Ultima 4 was pretty good, but we're talking back in the early 80s into the early 90s. Yeah, I loved it. RPG Ultima series was only available on the Apple II PC systems. So if you didn't have an Apple device, you couldn't play it. And then designed by a gentleman named Richard Garriott, who later went on to build Ultima Online, which again was probably the foundation for all massive multiplayer online games today. But the original game RPG series, Ultima, I absolutely loved. The story, I would say that game probably influenced me in a lot of ways, from going on adventures and trying to figure out ways to unlock, content in dungeons, to the storyline and the characters. I loved it. I think if we move to current day, modern day gaming, the Kingdom Hearts series, I really loved. From a mobile device, Angry Birds. Heck, I sometimes still play that today. I don't know what it was about Angry Birds, but Angry Birds is very interesting because Angry Birds became extremely popular because it was fun and interesting. But if you break it down, if we do that breakdown, it's still good versus evil, or birds versus pigs. And really what it is eggs and bacon. It's eggs versus bacon. Bacon and eggs. Somebody woke up and said, "Hey, I want to make a game based on breakfast. Bacon and eggs, pigs versus chickens." But Angry Birds is a marvelous game. And then, of course, I mentioned I played League of Legends probably for. I've played it since it came online. I've played World of Warcraft since it's come online. Star Wars, Old Republic. The Star Wars franchise has struggled a little bit in the gaming space, but the online version of Star Wars Online original, and then Star Wars: The Old Republic, both games I absolutely loved. So yeah, I've had a lot of really favorites over the years.
Plenty, I can see. I mean, we can tell from that you also are a game lover. Amazing. So, Chris, we don't want to let you go before we leave you with whatever final words you want to have for the audience. Of course, let us know where we can find out more about what you're up to. Before we say that, at least for now, it's game over.
Yeah, anybody can reach out to me. You can find me at chrishood.com. All of my social media profiles are there, so you can follow me. You can read my blog. I've got some other exciting things that are happening, writing a book, podcast that is being produced right now. So if you want to keep in touch with me, you want to reach out, you can do that over at chrishood.com.
Amazing. Thank you so much once again for sharing your experience, your time, your knowledge, all of the things that you've been sharing with us today. However, engagers, Chris, as you know, at least for now and for today, it is time to say that it's game over. Engagers, thank you for listening to another episode of the Professor Game podcast. And I'd like to know, how are you listening to this episode, to this podcast? If you're doing it through a podcasting app, and chances are that you are, and that could be anything that goes from Google Podcast, Apple Podcast, Spotify, any of these apps. If you're doing so, have you followed or subscribed for free this podcast? Have you rated the podcast? If you haven't, please go ahead and do so. That way we'll reach more engagers like yourself to achieve this mission of making learning amazing. And if you want any instructions, any pointers on how you can do that, you can go to professorgame.com/iTunes. And of course, before you go onto your next mission, remember to hit that subscribe, that follow button on the app you're using to listen to this episode, and listen to the next episode, of course, of Professor Game. See you there.